You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
That's right, everybody. We are back. Sons of the Shoe is here to deliver immediate reaction to Week 2 of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee rankings. I really wish they could simplify that so I don't have to say 6 goddamn words every time we talk about these rankings. But it is live, which means you can comment and let us know what you think the committee got right and wrong. I am monitoring my Twitter, which, when don't I do that? So at Nick Wilson says, at Spencito _, and we will get to your reaction on this. But as we get started, there were no changes in the top 8, Spencer. How outraged are you that there was no definitive change? How much better or worse do you feel about the playoffs because of this?
There's no outrage for me. I think the only real change in the top 10 even was just Oklahoma, right? They're the only team that dropped out basically because they lost again. I don't know what people wanted out of this, I guess, because not much changed, especially with the top 4 teams. They all won this weekend. I guess if you wanted to argue, and we talked about this a little bit last week, that Georgia finally played a ranked opponent and, it's the SEC, and so they're always better than everybody, so maybe that should have been enough to move them into number 1 instead of Ohio State. I guess I could hear you on that, but clearly the committee said the same thing that we've been saying about this Rutgers team, that it's not the Rutgers team of old that is it's a cakewalk game. They were 6-2 coming into that one. They gave Ohio State a little bit of a challenge, and then Ohio State emerged from it on the other side victorious. So, again, same style that they've kind of won all season. To me, it makes a ton of sense that they kept everything the way they did, specifically in the top 4. I'm more interested, I guess, in what happens now that Michigan starts playing better teams. They got to match up with Penn State. That Georgia plays another ranked opponent. We'll see if that matters. But yeah, I don't know how you could be outraged. The outrage, I guess, would have come last week when people were shocked that Ohio State was 1. And I can understand that to an extent because maybe the eye test didn't tell you they should be number 1. But after this week, if they were 1 last week, there wasn't a lot that changed to make you think that they shouldn't be 1 again.
Can we just start here? I fundamentally do not understand being this outraged about the playoff picture week 2 when the most thing that you just said was just true, which is, Georgia beat Missouri. Okay, they still have half of the quality wins that Ohio State has.
Right.
So I think we've reached a point, and I said this to you before we got rolling. I think this is now just the new BCS, where people want it to be what it can't be. Like with the BCS, wow, it's just a mathematical formula. It's imprecise, it's too precise, right? And it doesn't account for things that matter to us. It doesn't account for the eye test, right? Well, now we have the thing that accounts for the eye test, but the logic behind it isn't, a computer algorithm, and people just lose their minds. And it's guys, part of my job is to analyze things and be professionally mad at points and literally find the angle on whether I should be outraged or not. And I'm telling you right now, everyone's up their own ass on this. There was no reason to change the top 8. We can get into some of the machinations beyond that, but I just think people want to be mad. And I think you can be, I get it. It's not perfect, but I have no idea. It's it's the same arguments people were using for last week. Well, Ohio State's number 1. Well, okay. What did they do that should make them not be number 1 if they started number 1?
Right.
Because now, I understood the argument last week. I still think those people were talking out their ass. Ohio State had 2 great wins, and we're coming off a comfortable win over Wisconsin at night on the road. Okay, that's a tough place to play, universally agreed. So they had the best resume. So strength of record goes to them, plus their margin of victory was still top 7. So them's the breaks, Charlie. But I understood at least, but Georgia's more talented. That's a bullshit claim, but okay. Michigan's more talented. Okay, that doesn't mean anything. What are we talking on paper? Because I live in reality. But I at least understood it. Now, they barely covered against Rutgers. Kiss all of my ass.
I do think, Nick, I don't want to keep beating the dead horse at the Rutgers point, but I do think that's part of it is they see Ohio State beat Rutgers and they don't that win doesn't feel like a valid win to them because they're like, oh, it's Rutgers. It took you till the second half to pull away. Like people just write off Rutgers without unless you're watching college football regularly and you're really in tune with not just Ohio State, but sort of other things that are going on in college football and how other teams are performing. You don't get the full sense of like everything. Like I bet you there's people who think that Michigan State is a tougher matchup this weekend than Rutgers just because of the name Michigan State. And they've given Ohio State more trouble at times than Rutgers has. So I think that's part of it. But I think you're right. Like there's outrage just to be outraged. Like people just want to be mad. And I tend to feel like, Nick, yes, we get to the final version of the college football playoff rankings. And there's always some debate to be had about team number 5 or team number 6 and whether or not they should have got in, which is why we're going to 12. But at the same time, generally, I feel like they get the top 4 teams mostly right. And we're in week 2 of this thing. There is still a number of games to be played. It's why I think the practice of the ranking itself, I enjoy that we get to talk about it. And yeah, it's content for us. So great. I'm not going to complain. But at the same time, like the idea that like we're doing this so soon in the process and there's still so much that has to bear out, it really is almost just to get the outrage. That's almost exactly what it's built for.
I actually think they should start it before it really matters because I think it's easier to chart and to move
explain
things
yourself.
around.
Can you imagine if they just got to the last week and it was like, oh, hey, here's the top 4 teams.
Yes.
Like, here's take your pitchforks and your knives and your whatever and fight each other over if it's right or wrong.
Yeah, and then it was decided predominantly on the final week of the season and the title games. Like I just think like I think the more you have of this, it allows you to put more sense and more thought into it. And listen, the college football selection committee doesn't do that. But like that is on the people in the room. And like we can say, well, they're selective. Well, yeah, they're going to be selective. Like because we're leaving it up to the human element. So I think like the first like 2 to 3 weeks of this, I always think I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. It's good to see where they are, but like because college football the schedules are so backloaded that like next week to me is going to be the first time where I really think we can react because I think we can all agree Ohio State's going to be 10-0. Georgia's got Ole Miss, so that's a 1 versus a 9. So even if that's a close win, that's just a huge win for you. I think the most chaotic thing is that either Georgia loses to Ole Miss and or Michigan loses to Penn State, because then all of a sudden you're going to see the college football selection committee really find a way conveniently to try and find an SEC team, probably Alabama, into the top 4 or top 5.
Yeah.
But again, like I think we can have those conversations a week from now because of what has happened the last 2 weeks. And I'll say this, like I get so when people say like you said this, but I'm not addressing you with this. When people say like, oh, it's just to get people worked up the first couple weeks. That's good. Like to me, like I want the college football fan riled up over it. Where I think it's like ridiculous is that we've already gotten into like this trench warfare with the established college football media who just uses it as a bitch session about the current thing, the current way to do it. And it's like, okay, but you're not analyzing, you're not like picking a stance of Ohio State shouldn't be one for the second straight week or Georgia should be one. You know what I mean? You're just using it to say, well, the whole thing's bullshit. No. Like there's pros and cons to each way.
Yeah.
And like, I would love if you could do 6 weeks of the BCS or 8 weeks of the BCS, and then at some point you have a soft transition to the college football playoff rankings. The problem with that is even when we had the BCS, they didn't come out till right about now because you need a certain amount of games to establish criteria on. So we have to keep falling back. I think the flaw in this is the AP top 25 being the ways and measures of the college football playoff rankings until these come out. Like that's what I think is the bigger flaw, not the way they do it.
You just think that because like the AP is like so subjective and then it like all it all just kind of like everything changes because it does feel like the AP oftentimes is just based strictly off of like eye test. Like it's almost nothing else than eye test.
Yeah, well, and in fairness, and listen, you might be able to say the same thing about the college football playoff selection committee, but like, I'm not buying that the AP top 25 is paying attention to as many games.
But yeah,
as
that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Like
Yeah.
because that's why I think it's based off of eye test because these writers and the people that vote on this, they're just going and saying like, oh, they're checking box scores, right?
Yes.
Like they're not watching the tape on these teams to sort of figure it out. So I think you're probably right there. And yeah, like I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have, a couple weeks here or several weeks here to be outraged by it. I like I said, it creates content for us, so that's great. I'm just saying like this isn't the time necessarily to have yourself just being completely beside yourself in terms of the reaction to it. Like, why is Ohio State number one? It's like, well, there's still so much that has to bear itself out. We know Ohio State and Michigan are going to play. We know Georgia has some tougher games. We know Penn State and Michigan are going to play. Like, there's so many things that still have to happen. If they were one last week, it makes a ton of sense for them to be one again this week. I do wonder, Nick, as we transition to a 12-team playoff, is there like a limit that will prevent so much like just absolute nuts
bitching?
from that's the best way to put it. Just like people bitching. Like is 12 next year when they do the top 12 and they're like, here's the 12 teams that are in. Is that finally like the place where it's like, okay, it's okay? Or is it still just gonna be like, well, my team should be 1 or my team should be 2 or whatever? Because like everyone keeps saying that once they go to 12, it's gonna taint the entire process and taint the regular season, and none of it's gonna matter. And so is it just gonna be like, okay, my team's in the top 12, I can get behind that, or is it gonna be like now splitting hairs over team 13 versus team 12 and who actually should be 1 or who shouldn't when we know all these teams are actually going to get in the end?
I'm a firm believer that people will find reasons to complain.
No matter what.
Based off my 38 years on this planet and my 38 years of being a diehard football fan and a diehard sports fan, I think there will always be intrigue. I do think the immediacy of the pressure is going to go away, so maybe people don't overreact as harshly to the first 2 weeks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's a guess, by the way. We could still way overreact to who's number one when we all know, like, they can probably lose 2 games and still crack all of a sudden Alabama losing 2 games. Well, okay, you'll just be the 8th seed. They haven't lost 2 games this year, but if they were to lose 2 games, all of a sudden, well, now you're the 10 seed instead of the 4 seed. Chuck commenting that this Ohio State team reminds him so much of the 2022 team, average QB play, good running back.
The 2002 team.
Did I say 2022?
Yeah, you said 2022.
It's been a long day. Sorry, Chuck.
It's all good.
But says
that's Dustin's team.
That does just enough to win. Yeah, I think it's funny, man. Like, I think that 2002 team had a much more dominating defense. I think this defense is like really, really stout, but like they had like 3 NFL dudes getting to the quarterback. I think Tuimoloau probably is an NFL dude, but I don't think he's a day one dude. I mean, like a first round player.
Yeah.
Like, I thought they were a little more stifling with their pressure. I think Ohio State just is stout all around in all 3 phases of defense. So, like, and I'll be honest with you, like, I agree with the 2002 thing. I just don't know you can truly win a title like that this year.
Now.
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, now, but this year might be the exception that allows you to do it.
That's true. Yeah, we talked about that.
It's just a wonky year.
Yeah, we talked about that on the episode that we dropped earlier today. Like, it's a weird year where maybe this is the season where this type of style could win you a title. I like that comparison too, because who was like the offensive weapon you had on that team obviously was Maurice Claret.
Yeah,
I mean, dude was freaking amazing. Like we looking back on that, you realize like how good he could have been if things could have gone differently for him, and if he actually had gotten to the NFL and been able to take it seriously and all these different things. I mean, that guy was a dude, and it's sort of reminiscent of when Trevion Henderson's healthy, he is also very much a dude. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting the comparison there. And hey, we'll see if it can win you a title in 2023. But I agree with you that I think it's just the times and the way that college football is played have obviously changed. I think, Nick, like my biggest takeaway still, even a week later, is seeing how long Ohio State can stay at 1, because the longer you're at 1, like if we go through another week and Ohio State takes care of business against Michigan State, like we're expecting, I've tried to think this game against Michigan State is one of those games where I can't think of any way that they lose, unless it's like everybody just gets hurt. Like that's the only way, because even Purdue was like, they should beat Purdue, no problem. But you've seen them lose in Purdue before, and like weird, fluky things happen. Yep. This is one of those games where it's like, they're not losing this game. So let's say they take care of business against Michigan State. Maybe they cover the 31 or whatever the hell the point spread is, and they win going away. All right, well, if they're at 1 for another week, then even if Georgia takes care of business in their game against Ole Miss, and even if Michigan takes care of business against Penn State, it just builds the case that Ohio State and Michigan could both end up in the playoff if this continues. And I think that's the biggest thing to kind of keep an eye on here if you're an Ohio State fan, is like, the longer they stay 1, the more it benefits them in the long run, because you could talk yourself into, or the committee could even talk themselves into, putting 2 Big Ten teams in, sort of going off the question we asked earlier, which conference rather deserves to get 2 teams in the most. There would be a case there if Ohio State stays 1 all the way up until the Michigan game.
Well, and I think this is going to be a great week to see, like, all right, is this the week chaos hits? Because late in the season, when you've got as many top 25 matchups in the top 10, top 15 as we do, like, I mean, just running through these, number 18, Utah on the road against number 5, Washington. That feels significant.
It does.
I mean, even Miami going to Florida State and going to Tallahassee this weekend is significant. But Alabama versus Kentucky, Kentucky's a good team. Michigan versus Penn State. You start to look down this. Honestly, Rutgers versus Iowa could have a huge impact to who comes out of the West, and that could kind of affect seeding. Ole Miss versus Georgia. Like, you're starting to kind of look around here. I mean, even USC, Oregon. Oregon here, if they can give USC a convincing loss, all of a sudden, like, I think the committee made it very clear with where Alabama sits, and Alabama's sitting there at 8. I think they're lurking. And I think they're lurking because
they're always lurking.
Well, and listen, I'll be honest with you. I don't trust Lane Kiffin to beat Georgia this weekend because he's Lane Kiffin. And I would imagine if he does, that all of a sudden you're going to see Ole Miss kind of catapult up into the top 5. But like, if it's a close loss, I think you could end up seeing Alabama being the top ranked SEC team, or at least them trying to bunch them at like 5, 6, 7, just to try and like give the SEC its best chance to get, whether it's one legitimate team in or both, 2 playoff teams. I can see that happening. Here's the thing. I would love it if we could get it. I don't care who's 1, who's 2. I would love it if we could get Ohio State, Michigan as the top 2 schools rated in college football heading into the big game. I don't know that that's what the selection committee wants. I don't know that that would be all that interesting to the rest of college football. But, man, I'm telling you, I think if you go in 1, 2, even 1, 3, depending on who's 1 and who's 3, and I think there's a really good chance that this is a year where the Big Ten gets 2 teams in. And I think that's crucial. Like, one, because it's going to be, if it's going to be 2 teams, it's going to be Ohio State and Michigan State. I can't imagine. I can't imagine Penn State winning this weekend. 2, even if they did, they're Penn State. James Franklin will mess it up at some point. So like, I get myself worked up into a lather at the idea of Ohio State, Michigan playing at, Thanksgiving weekend. And then, whomever goes on to the Big Ten title, they win the Big Ten title. And then all of a sudden it's setting up that if both teams are in the playoffs, you're not going to give that away in the first round. You'd give it away in a hypothetical national title game. And that, to me, like, that's the sweet spot of what's possible if the Big Ten and the NCAA don't screw with Michigan and don't get them off kilter, and if Ohio State and Michigan can both remain undefeated to that final moment.
Yeah, no, that's a good point in terms of just like having those 2 teams meet with those stakes. I guess probably one final time with those stakes too before it expands to 12, and then Michigan and Ohio State could be in almost every year anyway. And I'm sure that'll be something that, other Ohio State fans outside of ourselves are obviously rooting for as well. Let me ask you this. What do you think is more likely after this weekend? Like if Michigan beats Penn State, let's say, I don't know, it's like a 10-point game or something like that, and they win.
Yeah.
Or if Georgia beats Ole Miss, who they're ranked 10?
Yeah, no,
It's
9. 9,
okay.
yeah.
So it's like it's 1 versus 9, and Michigan's 2 versus, or is Penn State 2? Is Penn State 9?
You're
Or no,
now confusing me. It's Georgia at 2 versus number 9 Ole Miss, and it's number 3 Michigan versus number
That's
10
right.
Penn State.
Okay.
You just started throwing numbers, and
I'm sorry.
I went to a MAC school. Once you start throwing numbers at me, I kind of skits out a little bit. Even though
man.
Bowling Green is an Ivy League school, there's ivy on the walls. Please look that up.
Okay, so if Michigan were to beat Penn State, I mean, this is the thing. Like, these matchups are so close to each other too, because it's like they could both win top 10 matchups here. But like, let's say Georgia plays a close game against Ole Miss, and Michigan beats Penn State by like double digits. Would it be possible that Michigan actually leaps Georgia and Ohio State to 1, or would it? Or if you kind of look at the other scenario, like what I'm trying to get at is like, what would it take, you think? Assuming Ohio State wins, maybe even if they don't cover, let's just say Ohio State wins by like 28 points or something like that. Like they win handily against Michigan State. What is it going to take from the other two, do you think, to actually jump up into that number 1 spot for either Michigan or Georgia?
I think either team. All right. So I think Georgia beating Ole Miss probably guarantees them 1. I think Michigan beating
no matter what, like if it's like on a last second field goal, you think it still pushes them up to
yes, because it's you can make a case it's the better win than anybody else has. And then, by the way, they'd have 2 top.
Other than Washington would still have the best win because they beat Oregon, who's higher ranked. But yeah,
I'm talking about the top 3 teams.
Yeah. I got you.
So I think Georgia beats Ole Miss any fashion, and they're probably 1. I think Michigan, it depends on how Michigan would beat Penn State. Like if it's another close game, I don't know that that's enough to leapfrog Ohio State before that. So maybe it's Georgia 1, Ohio State 2, Michigan 3. But there's a sliver. It's a sliver of Ohio State holding on to the number 1 spot, and they have to beat the ever-loving hell out of Michigan State.
Yes.
Like we're talking like 60-0, like the kind of win they haven't had at all this year.
They gotta put the type of ass whooping like they put on Wisconsin that year they went to the national championship.
It's either got to be that, or it's got to be one of those 2 teams losing, or some sort of fluky, overtime. Like it's got to be something convoluted if Ohio State beats Michigan State merely by 20 points. Like a pauper.
So okay, I think that's fair. Like you think Georgia probably jumps them as long as they win, and for Michigan to jump them, it would have to be like they absolutely just boat race Penn State. Probably is that kind of where your head's at? Yeah, I would agree. All
right. Well, so them's the rankings. We'll be back this Saturday. It's going to be a late one, but it will be live on here. We're going to see if we can get up on the 92 Through the Fan Twitter account as well, doing this live reaction post game after the Michigan State game. Why? Because somebody has to do it, and we're just the guys to do it. But, of course, we'll be back next week for the live post, the 3rd college football playoff rankings. We'll do that live. And let's see, we've got our Tuesday edition. We do have our Tuesday edition from this week up as well, where we preview Michigan State. We've got, what else do we have? Oh, in the middle of it, guys, if you have not seen today's podcast that we recorded earlier today, something happened in the very middle of an eloquent point Spencer was making about Ryan Day and Honda McCord that completely threw the podcast into disarray. It is absolutely worth it. You can check it out also because Spencer pulled it out because he's a gentleman, almost like the guy pulled it out. At Nick Wilson says, at Spencito _. But that does it. Please remember, make sure to follow, rate, subscribe, all the good things. As we're a new podcast, the Sons of the Shoe, greatly appreciate your support. Spencer, anything before we go, buddy?
No. Looking forward to the weekend. Obviously, well, we'll see. That game could be over. You know what? Maybe we'll be starting the show truly live during the game when it's wrapping up. Like 4th quarter, we'll just
like
be like, hey,
halftime.
Yeah, maybe halftime. Well, hey, this one's over. Let's spend a little bit of time together talking about how it's gonna end in an absolute wrap. But we'll see. Let's hope it goes that way.
All right, buddy. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Peace.